Well, welcome back this evening. Good to see you here this evening. As we've been announcing for a couple of weeks, the intention, maybe even for a couple of months unofficially, that the desire to take us through a journey through the most of the historic documents of Baptist that makes, really is the framework of most all Baptist confession statements from this day forward. So this evening, my intention is to put into your hands a lot of documents, a lot of reading material. You like to read, don't you? Well, you're back in school. So we're going to, basically I want to lay out a history lesson about why Baptist even felt it necessary to put together a confessional statement to begin with. When did that happen? When did it come about? And what have Baptists been doing since then? And so I want to lay out an argument for it. So here's your pre-test. Okay, so I was almost about to equate what I'm about to do tonight with scholarly work. I want it to be scholarly, but it's important that you have a pre-test so you can know what kind of progress you've made through the history lesson and what you've learned. So the first question to this pre-test is, what year was the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession written?
1689.
Okay, see now, some of you are going to be quicker than others to say out loud things that you should have waited to hear. And I'm not pointing out the front row, or at least a portion of the front row, or at least one person of the front row. But I am saying no. So here now we're all going to be able to gauge what we know at the end of this 20-week course. When was the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession written? Okay, 1677. All right, now you know. Now you know. The next time someone ever asks that question out loud, and before you answer out loud, you'll be able to answer with knowledge. I know, it's like, when did the War of 1812 happen? Well, I think you should be you should be bold then and say, well, 1812. But when it comes to the question of when was the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession written, you should answer with a little more reserved. 1677. Makes sense, doesn't it? The 1689 Confession was written in 1677. Well, I think the history of Baptist will help us here. So here's my first document that I want to pass out. And maybe, Bailey, would you be willing to help me? Can you make sure everybody gets one of these? Or at least every household gets one of these? Coming around here is the official signers of the 1689 Second London Confession. So, to give you just a little bit of background, in 1677, when the 1689 statement was written, in 1677, not all of the signers who signed the 1689 were at the convention meeting or at the drafting of what would have been called the 1677 Second London Confession, which would have been fair. But matter of fact, you can refer to it as the 1677 Confession Statement if you want to. But nobody in Baptist world will know what you're talking about, because they only know about the 1689 Confession Statement. Well, in 1689, these signers signed the 1677 Confession Statement, thus making this and the official document of the, and I don't know if people over here, Bailey, I think there's a few people on this side that still need a copy of that. Thank you for helping me out, Bailey, by the way. You get extra credit for tonight. But you look through the names here, and I'm going to make an argument. You may not know any of these names, and it would be all right that you don't know them. There are a few, and I'm not sure why my printing was upside down on the backside of some of these, so just forgive me for that. I do want to bring up one signer here. This is Benjamin Kish. He was the pastor of the, if you pronounce it the way it's spelled here, it's the Horse Lie Down in Southwark. These are pastors in England and Wales. I believe the pronunciation for this is Horsley Downs. But, you know, it's immaterial. Benjamin Kish is going to be one of the great, thank you so much, Mr. Bailey. He will be one of the greatest assets to Baptist, who publishes many documents, is really one of the reasons behind why the 1689 Confession Statement ever even gets published to begin with. But he will, of these names that are here, that one perhaps you might have heard about, or I would suggest to you would be one worth doing some research on your own if history is of interest to you. Let's see, there was one other that's not coming to, jumping right off of the page here for me. So perhaps I'll remember that before we go this evening. But certainly Benjamin Kish, who would have been one of the original signers. Matter of fact, Benjamin Kish is one of the signers that we know who actually did sign the 1677 Confession Statement of Baptist. So what's going on in Baptist life? We've kind of run through some history in recent months, or within the last couple of years anyway. The first, so it begs the question, if this is called the Second London Confession, then when was the First London Confession? So here's pretest number 2 for you. Okay, if the 1689 Second London Confession was originally written in 1677, when was the First London Confession Statement? What's that? You're going to hold off on this one, aren't you? You're going to say, I'm waiting for an answer. It was actually published in 1644. So in 1644 was the first time that the group known as what we call Baptist come together and write an official document that would describe the tenets, the beliefs, the confessions of Baptist in 1644. So in 1644, there's a lot of history going on in Christendom at this point, by the way. You might be familiar with our cousins in the faith, the Presbyterians. By the way, we should really look to them as brothers, not just distant cousins. We should really look to the Presbyterians as our brothers. Their most famous Westminster Confession Statement. Do you know when that was written? So pre-test question number 3. 1222. Steve's not being nearly as reserved as maybe he should have been at the moment, or quick enough with Google. The Westminster Confession was written in 1646. So take note of this. The first of the Baptist confessions are written in 1644. The first of the Presbyterian confessions is 1646. I think it's Vodi Bauckham who likes to bring this up in his bantering with our Presbyterian brothers, who always want to brag about their 1646 Westminster Confession when they're addressing the 1689 Baptist Confession. It's Vodi Bauckham who likes to remind them, oh, don't forget, we actually have a 1644, which is 2 years before. The most famous, really, of the Free Church confession statements that the Westminster Confession of 16. So it happens in London as well. The Westminster Confession is an English. So in the English-speaking world, it's not that we didn't have Christendom before the English began to articulate what we believed or what they believed, but it is a unique thing of interest of world history, and for that matter, church history, that the city of London is really a bedrock for articulating Christian doctrine. There are some really beautiful things happening. 1644, 1646, 1677, 1689. Now, to put some figures that both our Presbyterian brothers and our Baptist heritage, we actually both like to have some kind of an attachment to this historic figure of John Bunyan. Now, John Bunyan, I'll make an argument, is not going to be the most articulate theologian that you will ever read in the English-speaking world. But he is arguably among the most of the popular, or the most well-known, primarily because of his publication of Pilgrim's Progress. That in the English-speaking world, next to the English translation of the Bible, the single most published book in the English language and translated into world languages around the world, from a man, from the son of a tinkerer. His parents were essentially illiterate. Bunyan's education was, when you read about his history, it was a struggle for him even. But it would be by the kindness of God that God will save John Bunyan, and which, by the way, a great biography for you to read someday, the biography of John Bunyan, Grace Abounding. And in that we learn a lot of the beautiful things that are happening. And they're hard things. So keep this in mind. The great things that we can hold on to in the history of Christendom that come out of London, the heartbeat of the English-speaking world, comes with a lot of hardship. Comes with different acts put into place by kings. And they move back and forth from it's illegal to meet, it's legal to meet, or it's permittable to meet. It's required for you to have a license by the state. So in England at this time, the state church is what in America was the Church of England. In England, in America, is known as the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church. So it's the official church of England. So everything in politics in England in this time is governed by the state, by the government. And so that's why the hardship for the free church to exist in a country that moves back and forth from times when it's illegal to meet, it's illegal to preach, it's illegal to gather, it's illegal to write confessional statements. These things are happening in the heartbeat, in the very living technicolor of the mid 1600s. So we have our 1644 London Confession. This is the first. By the way, it's published. You can still get a copy of it. You can still read it. It's a real short statement. It's a good one, but it doesn't lay out everything that what the 1689 would later argue, that these are the statements of the baptized professors, will be one of the ways that they refer to themselves. Which this will be one of the things that distinguishes a difference between what will eventually be called the Baptist and the Presbyterians, and that is when we're baptizing, if we baptize our children. So John Bunyan, okay, date after date after date. Be as reserved as you want to be with this, or be as forward as you want to be. John Bunyan was born in the year 1689. No. Pilgrim's Progress was written quite some time before that. But I'll go ahead and give you the four. John Bunyan dies in 1688. He's born in 1628. he's baptized into the Church of England in 1628. Some of you who've been around during some of our church history times over the last couple of years will note that it was not uncommon. Matter of fact, it was even required of the law that if you were born in a city in England, you would be baptized. Whether your family were practicing believers or not, you would be baptized. That was your citizenship. Your citizenship was in the Church of England. Your citizenship was in England. And so you're born in 1628, as Bunyan was, you would be baptized in the Church of England. So this is actually not scandalous. This was just the way it was. And nobody in 1628 was doing anything otherwise. It was the general practice of the citizens in England that if you had a child born in this era, you would go down, you were assigned, you would have a parish that you belonged to. The parish usually was inside of the city limits of the city that it made up the city limits of the community that you lived in, the village you lived in, the shire that you were a part of. You would have a parish you belonged to, and the parish priest he kept a record of all the children who were born. And it was his duty to make sure that the children would be baptized. Otherwise, he's going to get himself in a lot of trouble with the church, with the state church. So, John Bunyan...
Sprinkling or immersion?
Oh, this would be sprinkling. They did not immerse infants. I mean, that would be a sight to see, I suppose, but this is sprinkling. Yeah. So, John Bunyan will later be baptized by immersion in a Baptist, we'll call it a Baptistic group. But that will become after his confession. Prior to this, though, he has the secular attachment to the Church of England, and it would have been with a sprinkle. So he dies in 1688, so that gives you a little bit of knowledge. John Bunyan, who many will argue was barely a Baptist. And as a matter of fact, I have some documents here that I think would probably support that. And our Presbyterians would love to say, well, he was more Presbyterian than he was Baptist. And when I get into those conversations, I actually think he was more Baptist than Presbyterian. But at the end of the day, we'll learn some things about what was going on between the Presbyterians and the Baptists during this era of time. Both groups will be called in this time, lumped together in the groups known as the non-conformist. So in England, you have the Church of England. It is the state church. The non-conformist will be those who gather in churches that are not being governed by the state church of England. So in other words, the state church has a book called the Book of Common Prayers. From time to time in the 1600s, depending on who was the king, who was in charge, and how much they were a part of the Church of England or not, it would be required reading in any religious gathering that the common book of prayers would be the standard use for those gatherings. Well, the nonconformist would say, not in our gatherings. The Bible will be the standard in which we will use to govern what we do when we gather together. So they'll be called the nonconformist. Presbyterians and Baptists alike would be called. And at times they would have favor with the government and fall out of favor with the government. And that terminology of nonconformist, it kind of sticks with them really more as a marker that this group of people are not following the rules. Now there would be times when it would be legal for you to gather and not be governed by the Church of England. There would be other times it would be illegal. And when it was illegal and you were out of favor with the state church, so keep all of this in mind. This is obviously pre-colonial. This is right on the verging of the developing of the Americas. The colonies, the late 1500s, the early 1600s, those transitions and those movements, the experimentations of civil governments. So all of this is happening. And under the persecution that they're facing in England, a lot of it from the Church of England, Americans, or what will become Americans, begin to flee England. Some will stay and they'll fight it out. Many of them, however, will board boats and they'll start looking for religious freedom in the new land of America. But in the meantime, guys like John Bunyan falls in and out of favor with the state government. And for that matter, all who would later be called Baptist are in and out of favor with the government. So there's these acts of the secular government, the state church government marriage. This will be one of the reasons why the founders of our country will argue for a separation of church and state. And you understand that doesn't mean that the two have no business together. It just means we want a land that a state church doesn't govern the federal government. So that will be some of the bedrock. That will be some of the reasoning, the rationale behind it. Well, in John Bunyan's days, so it's in 1660 will be the first time Bunyan will go to jail. He'll go to jail twice. The first time his sentence was for 3 months, and he was in prison for 12 years. At the time in which John Bunyan was in prison the first time, it wasn't that he could not gather with other nonconformists. In that particular time, he could not gather without a license from the state church. Meaning he had to be ordained by the Church of England to conduct religious services that were not of the Church of England. John Bunyan simply refused to be licensed by the government to preach. That's the only reason he goes to jail. It's not because he preached the gospel, it's because he refused to be licensed to preach the gospel. His sentence is for 3 months, and why does he stay in jail for 12 years then? Because he has fallen. This is a time when the nonconformists are out of favor with the state church. Now, that's the big umbrella government. John Bunyan has the favor of the local sheriff. The local sheriff, early in his imprisonment, would actually let him out on the Lord's Day to go preach. Eventually, while they crack down on that, the bigger the government begins to crack down on that, his fellowship, the church that John Bunyan is appointed pastor of, they will eventually come to the jail, and the sheriff will willingly let Bunyan out of the cell to preach to the people who've gathered there. So, but it's not to give you any kind of an indication it was not hard, it was not difficult. It was extremely difficult. At the time of John Bunyan's imprisonment, he had 4 children, and shortly after his, you know what, I'm going to, forgive me on this, I cannot actually remember when his wife dies. She dies either shortly after his imprisonment or shortly before, but he has 4 children, small children, and one of them is blind. It's a very hard, difficult, complex situation for Bunyan, for his wife, for the situation. So it's very hard. Bunyan is told almost on a daily basis, you can go home. So long as you go, 1, stop preaching because you won't get licensed, or go get licensed so you can preach. He was resolved in this matter that he could not bend to the court of man when it was God who had ordained the preaching. So this is the kind of non-conforming ancestry that both the Presbyterians and the Baptists alike have. During these days when they fall out of favor with the government, the Baptists and the Presbyterians go to jail together because of their refusal to get licensed to preach. So John Bunyan's not the only one who does this. Other fellowships, depending upon how the makeup of their local shires and their sheriffs, they will either have favor with them or they will not. And parishioners will go to jail during this time. all of this because they've attended illegal meetings. And so the complexity of this, it ebbs and flows. He's eventually released in 1672. This is John Bunyan. So I'm just trying to put a couple of things into place for you. So Bunyan would have been aware of the 1644 Baptist Confession. We don't know all of the signers of the 1644 London Confession. It was published, but it was in a time when the publishing of confessional statements was illegal. And so one reason we don't know everyone who signed the 1644, and I wouldn't fault them for not signing it when I look at it from this vantage point in church history, but there would be that complexity. So we don't know. There's none of Bunyan's writings that indicate he was one of the signers of the 1644. There's also none of his writings that would have indicated he was opposed to the 1644. The 1644 confessional statement would have been the overlying confessional statement of the nonconformist baptized professors. So again, that's the way they articulated their difference from the Presbyterians, who baptized their infants, sprinkled their infants. So moving along with time, eventually the act that sent Bunyan to jail was retracted, and Bunyan was released. He immediately goes back to gathering the people who were part of his church, and he continues on as the pastor. He'll go back to jail one more time, and this will move it toward, within a decade, he'll go back to jail. A couple more children are born during this time. And I believe it's in 1681. I didn't write down the date, but so those of you who have quick with Google, it's 81, 82 that he's released from his second imprisonment. So this is really not a history lesson about John Bunyan. This is just to put a historic figure in the story for us of the Baptist. And so 1681, 1682, Bunyan is released. He dies in 1688. And so keep this in mind, the close proximity. He's not one of the signers of the 1677, what is called the 1689 Confession. But again, it's not that we would find anything in Bunyan's writings that would argue otherwise for him. I'll submit this document that Bailey, can you help me again? Thank you, my friend. This document is what historically is called the Appendix 1 of the 1689 Confessional Statement. This was not published with the 1689 Confession, but this would have been written when the 1677, so the draft work of the 1689 was written. This document was part of that original 1677 document. And you'll notice when you get this, it'll say this is the Appendix 1 concerning or on baptism. So again, knowing our history with our brothers in the faith, our Presbyterian brothers who are baptizing their children, their infants, sprinkling their infants, and the nonconforming baptizing professors, the Baptist, attached this appendix to the 1677, but remember it doesn't get published until 1689 formally. And so why the 1689 guys did not publish this appendix with the 1689 is pretty unclear, historically unclear. But may I present this to you as perhaps one of the greatest arguments why baptism is not an issue for us to divide over. The mode of baptism and the timing of baptism. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't hold our ground on where we're at here. Thank you. Did everybody get one that wants one? Great. Can you drop one of these off to Brother Steve for me? Thank you, Bailey. When you read it, and I highly encourage you read it, here's why I'm going to make the argument that John Bunyan, or at least the sentiment of John Bunyan, is represented in this argument. John Bunyan, pastoring of a Baptist church, a church of baptizing professors, you'll learn when you read Bunyan's biography that one of the bigger issues in the mid-1600s amongst the Baptists and the Presbyterians is who can come to the table, the Lord's table. And the arguments are baptized believers ought to be the ones coming to the table. And then the argument is, well, you know, who's a baptized believer? Do we receive the baptism of infants who are not professing the Lord Jesus Christ? Can they come to the table? Or are we saying that only those who have been baptized by immersion can come to the table? Well, the Presbyterians, we'll just go ahead and give them this. They came to this conclusion much faster and arguably much easier for them. And that was that Baptists who are visiting and they gather with a Presbyterian crowd are welcome to the table. And the Baptist, what do you do when a Presbyterian is visiting and he joins you on a Lord's Day gathering and you're providing the Lord's table with him? Can they have access to the table? And the argument ensues. This appendix from the 1677 Baptist Confession makes a compelling argument that we don't really know. And we really should not divide ourselves over a tertiary matter. Now, it's a strong argument for baptizing professing believers only. In other words, essentially adults or those who have grown to the position where they know they're a sinner, they've sinned against God, they've repented of their sins, and they are professing Jesus as Lord, and they've been baptized by immersion. It's a strong argument for it. It's a good document that supports that argument. But at the end, the Baptists of 1677 were saying, we don't think this ought to be a dividing issue for us. So I'll submit it to you as a historic document that does not get published when the 1689 eventually gets published with signers and names on the dotted lines, but nobody disavows the appendix on baptism. So we'll get through all of this. The 1689 will address baptism, and when we get there, we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about it openly. And I hope if you have Presbyterian friends that you would have no problem fellowshipping with a Presbyterian over the matter, nor that they would feel any apprehensions about gathering with you for that very kind of a matter either. So those two documents that Bailey helped pass out for me are historic documents that I want you to know about. One, who were the signers of the 1689, and they gathered in 1689, and they basically ratified the 1677 confession statement. That act would be essentially the ratification of it. So there were signers of the 1677, but it was not published in the form of the 1689. So some of those signers of the 1677 are not signers of the 1689 because some of them have died. Bunyan would have been one of them that would not have been alive in 1689. That I don't know that it's fair for anyone to say he would have signed it or wouldn't have signed it. But again, I want to bring at least this Baptist historic figure along the timeline of the publication of the 1689. I'll say this on the front end: the understanding of Bunyan's position has been extraordinarily helpful for this pastor. That this is certainly a place where I stand firm on, that this pastor only baptizes professing believers. But why should I divide over my brother's decisions who have baptized their infants? Who, when you lay the 1689 Baptist Confession alongside of the 1646 Westminster Confession, you're going to find that these many times are webbed together very intentionally. The difference will be baptism. The primary difference will be baptism. And so when we get to the baptism section, as we walk through that, we'll note those differences. We'll see them and we'll bless the Lord and we'll understand where we are in church history. Now, that doesn't lay out everything for us. I want you to know some resources that have been of great benefit for me. The first one is a 20-year-old document written by Sam Waldron, who's still living. He pastors a Reformed Baptist church and is president of Reformed Baptist Seminary. He's the one who writes, of the modern writers, a great exhortation of the 1689 London Confession. This has been a great resource for me. I put it to you as great consideration. If you're interested, if you want to get into the weedier parts of who we are as Baptists, that's a great resource. One that has just been published, and I'm only 2 chapters into it because I got it while I was in North Carolina. It's that new of a publication, and it's a new exposition of the London Baptist Confession of Faith of 1689. And this is a compilation of Baptist writers, Sam Waldron being one of those contributors to this resource. And so I commend it to you in the sense that I have not read it all yet, but I'll tell you, the introductory chapter of this book was extraordinarily helpful. And so for that alone, I would say, if you're interested in spending money on books, get yourself this new exposition of the London Baptist Confession. These 2 books are not necessarily books that I've referred to in recent preparation for this, but I'll say that these are extraordinarily helpful for us in knowing who we are as Baptists. One of these is by Pascal Denault. It's the Distinctives of Baptist Covenant Theology, and the other is Covenant Theology from Adam to Christ, Nehemiah Cox and John Owen. Baptist Presbyterian, and more Baptist than Presbyterian, and a little bit of Presbyterian inside of the Baptist. Covenant theology is one of the theologies that I would argue most of us don't know anything about.
That's what I was going to ask. And what is a Reformed Baptist?
Yeah, we'll dig through all of those things. That's a good question. So matter of fact, it's a great transition over to the next document, or the next book that I would commend to you. So I will just put those up for you. The Distinctives of Baptist Covenant Theology by Pascal Denault, and Covenant Theology from Adam to Christ, Nehemiah Cox and John Owen. So let's move church history into the Americas. Okay, so we have the forming of American colonies. I'm trusting you understand this. So there was a lot of experimentation in the colony developments in America. Initially, the colonies were designed as parish colonies, denominational colonies. So Baptists moved into this area, the Presbyterians moved into that area, this group, the Quakers, moved into this area. There was a lot of that experimentation moving on in the early colonial days. And I would say, I'm glad it didn't really finish up like that. But nonetheless, it sets the framework of how do you transition from London, England in 1644, 1677, 1689 to the United States, or what will eventually become the United States. And that will become with the first of the Americas confessional statement of the Baptist in what's called the Philadelphia Confession of Faith. So there will be 2 American adaptations of the London Confessions, one of the Baptists and one of the Presbyterians. The Westminster Confession will have an American counterpart. The 1689 confessional statement will have an American counterpart as well, and that is the Philadelphia Confession. So from the Philadelphia Confession, you will find that in the American experiments of Baptists organizing themselves into churches and to associations, to conventions that this document will be more widely used early in American Baptist history. Eventually, the 1689 will regain its popularity. And I'll make the argument that now, today, most Baptists who are organizing themselves under the historic Baptist positions are doing so under the 1689. It's not to mean that the Philadelphia Baptist Confession is a bad statement. It's actually almost word for word, verbatim. It was an adaptation of England to America. And so it addresses a couple of things. It addresses the significance of singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. So there's a chapter on that in the Philadelphia Confession. It's a beautiful chapter. And it's one I think Baptists, for some reason, lost our psalm singing strength through the years. And another distinctive of the Philadelphia Confession that I don't really care for, I don't know what the difference of why the 1689 guys were not practicing this, but this was a laying on of hands of the congregation during baptisms. Unnecessary. So give or take, like or dislike, the documents, I would be perfectly happy to be organized as a church under the Philadelphia Confession. Now, that still predates this church's organization. And at that time, we should even say, predates Southern Baptist, which I know we're no longer a Southern Baptist church, but it is part of our history. It's a part of this church's history. And so we bring into full swing what's going on in the group that will eventually be known as a Southern Baptist, organized in America, and the distinctive differences of those will come of those who are forming themselves as pro-slave owners of the South. We'll say, bless the Lord, they've repented of that. Southern Baptists no longer would show themselves in any position favorable toward the slavery days of early America. So bless the Lord. They've swept it away and said, we're sorry our ancestors behaved like this. We do not think like this, and bless the Lord. Okay? It's behind us and we press along. Southern Baptist organized the first of the seminaries, what's called the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. It organizes with a confessional statement called the Abstract and Principles. Okay, so it's not the 1689 London Confession. It's not the Philadelphia Confession. It's the document entitled the Abstract and Principles. It's a good document. If you're interested in more reading material, I would suggest to you, you just Google it up. You'll find a copy of the Abstract and Principles, and there will be a beautiful Baptistic confessional statement. So Southern Baptist, the first seminary that is organized of Southern Baptist, is not what they would adhere to today, which is commonly called the Baptist Faith and Message. It was a document that was instructed, penned, signed, and put into place, and still is the governing document of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Now, it's now required of seminaries who receive funds from Southern Baptist that all of their professors must be in agreement with the Baptist Faith and Message, which is the newer document. And I'll make the argument to you, they're good documents. This church, in the early 1970s, when Eastside Baptist Church was established, did not establish themselves under the Baptist Faith and Message. It actually organized itself under what is called, they've got so many names of these things. It was organized under what was called the 1925 New Hampshire Confession. Now, there were previous New Hampshire confessions. The 1925 was not the first of the New Hampshire Baptist confessions, but it was, and still is to this day, the basic underlying document that defines and articulates what Southern Baptists adhere to. So the New Hampshire Confession in the 1960s will gain the change of its name from the 1925 New Hampshire Confession to the generic name, the Baptist Faith and Message. Again, in the early 2000s, there was an update to it, and it is still a document that most Southern Baptists will organize themselves under. It's not required that they do, but it is expected, and most are and most do. So you might be asking, well, then pray tell, dear preacher, why not just keep operating ourselves under the 1925 New Hampshire Confession? And I say we can. And so we're not deciding anything tonight, by the way. Have I told you that up front? We're not saying we're throwing any of our historic documents away and we're adopting new ones tonight. And by new ones, I mean older ones. But I do want us to be in this in a conversation moving forward, because we have officially, formally left the Southern Baptist Convention, which, by the way, if you're not paying attention to what's going on in the Southern Baptist Convention, what's going on will affect Baptists everywhere, whether we're a part of it or not. And New Orleans, which is where the next Southern Baptist Convention meeting convenes in just about 3 weeks from now, they have a battle on their hands. A battle of epic proportions. The history of Baptists in America will be argued in about 3 weeks. Let's pray they hold strong. Let's pray they stand their ground. I'm not saying it's not looking good, but I'm saying it's not looking so good. Okay? Perhaps the single most influential Southern Baptist pastor has lined up to combat the whole of the convention. Rick Warren is making arguments that Baptists have always believed women can be pastors. And I've got a slew of Baptist documents that, and still to this day, the documents that Baptists and the Southern Baptist Convention use clearly articulate that we hold the office of pastor, elder, can be held only by biblically qualified men. So there's a battle. This is not a new battle that showed up. This one has been raging for a long time. And it looks like it's going to come to a head. And may God give mercy to the Southern Baptist. If they hold the line, you don't need to be wondering, well, preacher, are we going back? We are where we are today. And so this is where we're at, and it's time for us to look at our history. So again, with just a few more historic pieces in mind for you, the question about what is a Reformed Baptist. Reformed Baptist would be organized under what's called the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. Now, in John Bunyan's day, and by the way, we move a couple of centuries down the road to Charles Spurgeon, the most popular and well-known historic Baptist, adhered to the 1689 Baptist Confession, the Second London Confession, which was written when? Okay, yeah, you can say it with a little more confidence now. 1677, right. So Charles Spurgeon was a strong adherent to the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession. Baptists were not called Reformed Baptist in this era, even through Charles Spurgeon's day. Baptists don't get the marker of Reformed Baptist until the early 1900s. And a Reformed Baptist would be a 1689 Baptist. He would be what was called a particular Baptist. I know, just what you needed, another term that you've never heard before. We're going to get there. The 1689 will help us articulate what a particular Baptist was. In a condensed version, a particular Baptist believes that the atoning work of Jesus Christ was applied particularly to the elect. So, could the blood of Christ save everyone in the world? The answer, you should always say, yes, it can. Yes, it could. But Baptists believed that it was applied only to the professing. And it was a particular application of the blood of Christ. So that's why we're not universalist. That's why we're not, if you're born, you get to go to heaven. This is a confessing statement. And Baptists are confessors. We have a confessional statement. You might have heard Baptists be referred to as non-creedal people. That's not true. Baptists have always been confessional people. What's the difference between a creed and a confession? A very thin line. But confessions mean basically we're saying this is what we believe. A creed is a statement, this is what we believe. So Baptists are not unlike our Presbyterian brothers. We have a confessional statement that articulates what we believe about the nature of God, the nature of man, the work of salvation. All of these will be addressed in the confessional statement, and we'll walk methodically through each of them. So Baptists have always been confessional people. Even this church in 1972 was a confessional church who adopted the 1925 New Hampshire Confession that was built off of the Philadelphia Confession, that was built off of the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession. So Southern Baptists, because this is still part of our history, Southern Baptist, whenever the formation of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention, the earliest presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention and the earliest seminary were all under what would be called, in their day, particular Baptist. So I'm making the argument from where we stand today, irregardless of perhaps where we're going to land on some of the articulated pieces here, the history of Southern Baptist is in agreement with the 1689 as particular Baptist. What today might be referred to as Reformed Baptist. Reformed Baptist is another marker that is given to us. We'll see some things that will help us understand that better. But we believe we should operate ourselves in the local church under the regulatory principle of the Bible. The Bible regulates what we do as a church. Now, I will reject and I'll throw off the idea, no creed but Christ. It sounds good, but do you know how many Christ are in this world? I mean, even inside of professing evangelical American churches, to say no creed but Christ, well, what Christ are you talking about? I'm talking about the Christ who's articulated in the Bible. So essentially, the Bible is our regulatory principle. It's what governs what we believe, how we would articulate what we believe, and it governs us, not our feelings, not our emotions, not even our history. The Bible. We love to know that at one time in Baptist history, we were called a people of the book. But I'm not so sure that would be said of many Baptists today. We're the people of our feelings, the people of our heritage, the people of our history, the people of our denomination. If we're going to be known as a people of the book, then we have to have a confessional statement. We have to have an article of faith. Now, this is why we can continue to function perfectly fine under the 1925, but I want to say this is a good moment for us to say, would it be appropriate? Would it be agreeable among us that we might consider the 1689 as a governing document? Well, here's what I would suggest to you over the course of the next several weeks through the summer months is that you become as familiar as you can with the 1925 New Hampshire Confession Statement. Matter of fact, while we're reading the 1689, while we're going through each of the paragraphs, I will bring into the conversation each of those nights. I will say, here's what the 1925 Confession Statement says. Here's what the 1689 says. And you're going to see in many of the occasions, it's almost taken off the pages of the 1689 Confession. Be more modern English. Bless the Lord for that. I got you a copy of the 1689 Confession Statement in modern English. You're welcome. You are most welcome. All right. I'm going to wrap up and give you a couple moments for some questions if you have any early questions. One more document that's not published with the 1689 is the preface to the 1677. Now, just keep this in mind. It was really risky to be a Baptist in the 1600s in London. I'm going to give these brothers a lot of grace that they didn't publish everything together. Some of them were probably in jail whenever these documents were or they were being hunted. Sometimes even being hunted by the Presbyterians. But that's just fun history, okay? It's a lot of fun, isn't it? Okay, who would be willing to pass this out for me? Make sure I want every household to get one of these. I think, is Bailey out there with you, Brad? Oh, well, we're not going to disrupt his good work there. Okay, Brother Mark, thank you. So make sure every family gets one of these. Hey, this is required reading material between now and next Sunday night. No, it's really not required. I will argue this will be helpful to put the history into place here. While that's making its way around, can I ask if your other children? I should have asked if Bailey could help instead of just asking him. Would you guys be willing to pass these out to people? Okay, thank you. Maybe you could employ at your own expense someone else to help you. This the bound document that is being passed around is the 1689 London Confession in modern English, without the preface of 1677, without the appendix of 1677, but with some introductory remarks on, thank you, brother, on why it's important that Baptists know about this part of our history. So while you're getting those final documents, what questions do you have on the early side, Michael? Yeah, the reason why. Let's have this conversation as a church. I think that the 1689 gives us a better position for any direction we go forward. The 1925 does put some restrictions on us, only because other organizations are going to say that if you want to be a part of us, they're not even mentioning our 1925 documents. But they'll say, does your church adhere to the 1689 Baptist Confession? So when we're done with this, I'm going to ask the church body, would you be willing to adopt this as our article of faith? The 1689. Yeah. Yeah, no, because that's one we already have. We're already perfectly, beautifully handling ourselves under the 1925. Yeah, this would be, would you be willing to transition our article of faith from the 1925 New Hampshire Confession to the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession? In doing so, if we do so, it puts us in position to have other Baptistic groups that we could align ourselves with a common document. Groups like G3 is a group of Baptists who network together. It's not a denomination. They just network together. There's another group of Baptists called the Fire Network. They too would require, if you will want to participate in their network of churches, that you would adhere to the 1689 London Baptist Confession. The confederation between Presbyterians and Baptists, known as the CREC, group, so the Presbyterians in that network adhere to the Westminster, and the Baptists who adhere or who participate in that network adhere to the 1689 Baptist Confession. So they basically take that article that I gave you that articulates the position on baptism. We would not lose our identity as a Baptist to join a group that confederates together with Presbyterians. We would not be forced to baptize infants. So it would be a document that they would require as well. And at the end of the day, we may not decide to join any of those groups. But I'm confident of this, we're going to need to have something more than the 1925 New Hampshire Confession to get networked together with other Baptists. Unless we're going to stay with Southern Baptists or go back to Southern Baptist, then we might as well keep our 1925 statement, because it is the framework for the Baptist faith and message. So that's a good question. That's the argument behind why I want to say, one, I want us to know about the 1689, and I want to know, would this fellowship be willing to adopt it as our article of faith? Good question. David? Yeah. Yeah, if you couldn't hear what David's saying, is that back whenever we were making the decision to leave the Southern Baptist Convention, and we had that clause in our Constitution, which is different than an article of faith. The Constitution is how we organize ourselves here locally. And in that, we discovered that there were our Constitution and bylaws that we operate under, we can do so, but we are a radically different, we're not different theologically, but in practice, we do things and have been doing things really different than most Southern Baptists were. And those of you who are around here and have been around here at all in the history, you know, other than the fact that we adhere to Baptistic theology, we don't practice in part what many Baptists do. We are behaving more like a particular Baptist church who regulates herself under the authority of Scripture. And that's all we do. Good. Okay, so you have a lot of reading material. Let me just say, my own personal experience, it's not real good to read around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The eyes get pretty heavy. But read it when you're alert. I say read it with a pen and paper. I want to exhort families to read this together. Husbands and wives to read this together. Read it out loud. Think about it out loud. At the end of the day, here's one of the things that really marks a true confessional statement, is that it is subordinate to Scripture. It is an attempt of man to explain the theology that we understand in Scripture, but the confessional statement is always subordinate to Scripture. And so as we journey through this, would there be anything in the 1689 that we would disagree with? All right? And it would be okay to disagree with the 1689. What we can't do is disagree with this. We must not do this. All right. You have a lot of reading material. Next week, here's what we'll do, is we'll jump right into chapter 1 of the 1689 Baptist Confession. You have all of the history behind it. You have all of the arguments. So they have the historic figures, the most prominent of them, who's alive during this time, the impact of it, and we're going to get straight into the confessional statement, what it says about the Scriptures. What did Baptists in 1677, what did Baptists in 1644 believe about the Bible? Do we agree with them or do we disagree? So we'll read through the confession. We'll compare it to the 1925. I'll give some biblical exhortation about here's why this statement says what it says, and this is why we believe this. And bless the living God. All right, let's pray together and we'll be dismissed.